Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we begin a long journey through the Aeneid by Virgil, written around 19 BC. This is the first part, and it tells of the fall of a great city. For 10 years, the Greeks besieged the city of Troy, and on this night, it will fall. We tell how it happened, and how one man escaped the flames to found something new in a distant land. Make yourself comfortable, leave the day behind you, and come along into the last night of Troy. For 10 long years the army of the Greeks had lain before the walls of Troy, and the city had withstood every assault. Neither by force of arms nor by cunning had the besiegers managed to overcome the strong gates. But then they devised a plan of great treachery. They built an enormous horse of wood, tall as a house, and pretended that it was an offering to the gods, a gift meant to secure them a safe voyage home. In truth, however, hidden in the hollow belly of the horse were chosen warriors, armed and ready. Then the Greeks acted as though they were abandoning the siege. They burned their camps, boarded their ships, and sailed away, but only as far as a nearby island where they kept themselves hidden and waited for the signal to return. The Trojans, who saw from the walls that the enemy camp was deserted and the ships gone, could scarcely believe it. After 10 years of war, they opened the gates and streamed out into the open. They wandered across the abandoned fields where the enemy had stood for so long and marveled at the mighty wooden horse that had been left behind alone. They gathered around the monstrous thing and did not know what to make of it. Some wished to draw it into the city and keep it as a token of victory, while others were seized by a dark feeling, and they advised distrusting the gift of the enemy. Among them, a priest named Laocoon raised his warning voice. He hurried forward and called out to the assembly that they should not trust the horse. Whatever it might be, he said, he feared the Greeks, even when they bore gifts. And to give weight to his words, he hurled his spear against the wooden body so that it boomed dully in the hollow interior. Scarcely had Laocoon hurled his spear when some Trojan shepherds led forward a captured young man whom they had seized nearby. He was a Greek, and he had deliberately placed himself in their hands to play a deceitful game. Sinon was his name, and he was a master of dissembling. He threw himself down before the Trojans and wailed that his own people had betrayed him and marked him out for sacrifice, and only by flight had he escaped death. With tears and clever words, he won the pity of the Trojans, and when they began to believe him, he told them the decisive lie. The wooden horse, he said, was a sacred offering to the goddess Minerva. The Greeks had built it so large that the Trojans could not draw it through their gates into the city, for once it stood within the walls, it would grant Troy mighty protection and make the city invincible. These words awakened in the Trojans the very wish to bring the horse into the city at any cost. And then, something terrible happened that swept away the last doubt. While Laocoon was sacrificing to the gods on the shore, 2 enormous serpents rose up out of the sea. With heads reared high, they glided over the waves to the shore and hurled themselves straight at the priest and his 2 sons. They coiled about the children first, and then the father, who rushed to their aid and strangled all 3 in their coils before anyone could intervene. Then the serpents vanished and hid themselves at the feet of a statue of Minerva in the temple. The Trojans froze in horror. In this ghastly death, they saw a sign from the gods. Laocoon, they believed, had been punished for desecrating the sacred horse with his spear. Now there was no holding back. They tore down part of the wall, laid rollers beneath the feet of the monstrous thing, and drew it into the city amid rejoicing and song. Children and maidens danced around it and touched the ropes with pious joy. And so the Trojans, with their own hands, brought ruin within their walls. Night came over Troy, and the city, exhausted from rejoicing and celebration, sank into deep sleep. The people suspected nothing of what lay before them, but out on the sea the Greek fleet, which had hidden behind the nearby island, turned about and returned in complete silence to the coast. And within the city, the traitor Sinon gave the agreed signal. Secretly he crept to the wooden horse and opened the hidden hatch in its belly. One after another the warriors climbed out who had hidden inside, silent and armed. They lowered themselves down by a rope and spread out through the sleeping city. They slew the few guards, opened the gates from within, and through the opened gates now streamed the whole Greek army, which had in the meantime drawn near from the ships. So ruin broke over Troy, while its inhabitants slept unawares. On that night, Aeneas, too, lay in his house and slept, and in a dream a figure appeared to him. It was Hector, the greatest hero of Troy, who had fallen in the war. But this Hector no longer looked like the radiant warrior of old. He was wounded, bloody, and sorrowful. He warned Aeneas in a solemn voice. "Flee," he said. "The city is lost. The enemy is already within the walls. Troy falls this night. Save yourself, and save the sacred images of the city's gods, for it is ordained for you to journey with them across the sea, and to found for them a new and great city." Aeneas awoke from this dream, and at once the noise of battle reached his ears from outside, the shouting, the clash of weapons, the crackling of the first fires. He climbed onto the roof of his house and saw how everywhere in the city flames were rising, and the battle raged. Then he knew that Hector's warning was true, and a wild grief seized him. Aeneas did not think of flight in that moment. Rage and despair drove him out to take up arms and fight for his city as long as there was breath in him. He rushed into the street, and soon a few Trojan warriors who had not yet fallen gathered around him. Together they threw themselves against the enemy, into the very midst of the burning city's turmoil. They fought desperately and killed many a Greek, but against the overwhelming force nothing could be done. Everywhere the Trojans fell back. Everywhere the enemy pressed forward. Aeneas saw atrocities that were etched into him forever. He saw how the aged King Priam, the ruler of Troy, sought refuge at his own household altar, surrounded by the women of his family. And he saw how the son of Achilles, a wild and merciless warrior, slew the old king before the eyes of his own people, there at the sacred altar where no one should have done violence. This sight shook Aeneas to the core. The death of the old king, cut down helpless in a holy place, showed him that Troy was truly at an end. And suddenly he thought of his own aged father, of his wife, of his little son whom he had left alone at home. The fear for them tore him out of his battle frenzy. He looked around and stood all at once alone, for his companions had fallen or been scattered. Then he resolved to return to his house and save his family. On the way through the burning streets, his divine mother Venus appeared to him. She held him back and spoke to him. It was not the fault of men alone, she said, that Troy was falling, but the gods themselves had decreed the city's destruction. He should give up the hopeless fight and care for his own. She would protect him. And for a moment she opened his eyes so that he saw the gods themselves at work, tearing down the walls of Troy. Aeneas obeyed his mother and hurried through the fire to his house. There he found his aged father Anchises, but the old man refused to flee. He did not wish, as a frail old man, to seek a new home, but would rather die in his falling city. In vain Aeneas implored him. The father remained firm, and Aeneas, torn this way and that, was about to take up his weapons again and find his end in battle, since he could not save his own. Then two miraculous signs occurred. Around the head of little Ascanius, the son of Aeneas, there suddenly appeared a soft, flaming glow that did the child no harm. And when Anchises, struck by this, prayed to the gods for a further sign, a bright star shot across the sky and pointed the way out of the city. Now at last the old man let himself be swayed and was ready to go with his son. Aeneas lost no time. He took his aged father upon his shoulders, for the old man could not walk quickly enough, and Anchises carried the sacred images of the city's gods in his hands. Little Ascanius he took by the hand, and his wife Creusa he charged to follow them. So they set out on their way through the burning city, out into the open, with Aeneas choosing every dark alley to escape the enemy. His heart pounded at every sound, for now, bearing the precious burden of his family, he feared every danger that he had disregarded before in battle. They had come almost to the gates when suddenly a noise arose, and Aeneas, in the confusion, strayed from his path. When he looked around, his wife Creusa was no longer behind them. She had been lost in the turmoil and the darkness. A horror seized Aeneas when he noticed that Creusa was missing. He brought his father and son to a safe place outside the city and entrusted them to loyal companions. But then he turned back, into the burning city, to search for his wife. He put on his weapons again and ran back the ways he had come, into the very midst of the danger. He searched the streets, called her name, even returned to his house, which now stood in flames. But nowhere did he find her. In despair, he wandered through the alleys where the enemy was already plundering everything. Then suddenly the figure of Creusa appeared to him, but it was only her shade, her ghost, larger than in life. She spoke gently to him and begged him not to drive his grief beyond all measure. It was the will of the gods that she should not follow him into the distance. A long road across the sea was ordained for him, and at its end, a new land and a new happiness awaited him, a royal bride and a great kingdom. But she must remain behind. He should not mourn for her, but preserve their shared love and protect their son. Aeneas wished to embrace her, but 3 times he grasped at emptiness, for her shade slipped from his hands like a breath of wind, like a dream. So he had to let her go. With a heavy heart he returned to his own, to the place where he had left his father and son, and there, to his astonishment, he found a great throng of people gathered. They were other Trojans, men, women, and children, who had escaped the destruction and now gathered around him, ready to follow him wherever he might lead them. They had lost everything and placed their last hope in him. As the morning grew light, Aeneas led the throng of survivors into the mountains, away from the ruined city. Troy had fallen. Its towers lay in ashes, and what had once been a mighty city now smoldered as a field of rubble behind them. But Aeneas carried a task in his heart. He knew from the words of Hector, of his mother, and of Creusa that it was ordained for him to found a new Troy, somewhere in the distance. In the mountains, sheltered from the enemy, the survivors began to build ships. It took a long time, for they had to fell wood and do carpentry, and no one knew exactly where the journey should lead. When the fleet was at last ready, they boarded the ships in early summer and put out to sea, into the unknown, away from the coast on which they had been born. It was a hard parting. They left behind the graves of their ancestors, the earth of their homeland, and looked back with sorrow at the vanishing coast. Aeneas stood on board, his father and his son beside him, and carried with him the sacred images of the gods of Troy, the only bond to all that had been. Before them, however, lay the wide, open sea, and no one could say how long they would have to sail, or what dangers awaited them. In the first days they sailed along foreign coasts and sought a land where they might settle. Again and again they believed they had found the promised destination, and again their hope deceived them. For it was not pleasing to the gods that they should settle here or there. A long road still lay before them, and the destiny of Aeneas was to be fulfilled only after many years and on a distant shore. So began the long wandering of Aeneas and his people, but that is a story for another time. On that night of which we have told, a whole world came to an end. A city that for 10 years had defied every assault fell in a single night through cunning and betrayal. What weapons had not been able to do was accomplished by a wooden horse and the credulity of those who trusted it. And yet, in the midst of the ruin, there lay a seed of hope. For not all had fallen. One man had carried his aged father on his shoulders and his little son by the hand out of the flames, and with him he had saved the sacred images of his homeland. Aeneas thus carried more than his family into the distance. He carried the memory of Troy itself and the destiny to let something new arise from the ashes of the old city. He did not yet know where his path would lead him. Immeasurable expanses of sea still lay before him, storms, foreign lands, and heavy trials. But the fire that consumed Troy was at the same time the beginning of a long journey, at whose end an empire would one day stand, greater and mightier than anything that had been before. On that night, however, none of this could be foreseen. There was only a man who sailed out onto the dark sea, the smoke of his burning homeland at his back, and who turned his face toward the uncertain future, borne by nothing but the trust that the gods had a plan for him. And so we lose sight of him for this evening, upon the waves, on his way to a destination he did not yet know. That was our short retelling of the first part of the Aeneid by Virgil. We have seen how Troy, after 10 years of war, fell in a single night through cunning and betrayal, and how Aeneas escaped with his father, his son, and the sacred gods of the city to seek a new home in the distance. Next week we continue here with part 2. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.